And then without further ado, I'd love to welcome our moderator for this evening, Lovell. She's the City of Seattle's Deputy Director of Economic Development. She's a widely decorated and active member of our Seattle startup community, not only as an entrepreneur herself, but also as a Techstars, 9 Mile Labs, and Founders Institute mentor, amongst many other things. We're super lucky to have her tonight, and I'll let her introduce our featured speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, Clayton Lewis really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Thank you.
I would say that you are at least a triple threat, having worked in private sector, government, and spending time in nonprofit. So he's got a long track record as an entrepreneur and a business leader. Kinetics Living, which was focused on fitness and nutrition programming. Market Leader, which you may remember as House Values and Onvia, to name a few. He went on to serve as Chief of Staff, actually, for Representative Louise Slaughter in New York, who, amongst many other accomplishments, championed the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So keep that in mind as a theme for Clayton's career here. Moving on, you're now a GP and COO at Mavron, or did you? All right, so you're still doing that, juggling, keeping a lot of balls in the air here, and he really focused his practice on leading investments in health and wellness. In your spare time, I can't imagine that you have any of it. I know you served as board president for the Chicken Soup Brigade. If you don't know them, they're really focused on healthcare and health and wellness for people living with HIV, as well as serving on the board of Flying House Productions, really promoting acceptance of the LGBTQ community. So again, you're probably hearing a lot about wellness and inclusion. It's probably no surprise that Clayton is here to tell us, I hope, a little bit about your current venture, Arivale, and then focus really our discussion tonight on diversity and entrepreneurship. I think it's always an important topic, and it feels particularly poignant right now, so I can't wait to dive into it with this group. Just to give you a little sense of the flight plan, we'll do some kind of lightly moderated questions, although we really want you to engage, so don't consider it an interruption, and we'll save time for more of that Q&A in the end. So please join me and give him a warm co-motion welcome to Clayton Lewis.
Thank you.
So before we really dive into the topic of the evening, please do give us at least a teaser about what you're doing with Arivale. I think it's so exciting, and if you're not familiar with it, you should be. So give us the elevator pitch, if you will.
So Arivale exists to help people optimize their wellness in the short term, but more importantly for decades to come. And of course, what's the inverse of being well? It's being ill. And the way we do that is that for each of our pioneers, we call our participants pioneers, we create this dense dynamic cloud of data. It's got 4 components to it: whole genome sequence, clinical labs, and think twice as many measurements twice as often as your annual physical. Third quadrant is your gut, so microbiome, very much a nascent quadrant, but we think it's going to be really important in discovery in terms of helping people optimize their wellness. And the fourth quadrant is everything you do in your life. So we take this very complex, rich set of data, we analyze it, and then we assign you a coach. And what the coach is going to do is she or he are, 1, experts in the art of behavior change. 2, they're all licensed professional dietitians, backed up by a clinical team, backed up by a physician. And she's going to dive deep and say, okay, what's it mean to be well to you? Why do you want to be well? What's being healthy look like? And ultimately, what are the life experiences that you want to take this thing we call our body, and what journey do you want to go on? And based on that, then she's going to work with you every month, come up with 2 to 3 actionable recommendations based on this data of what can you do to be optimizing your wellness. Mm-hmm. So we say we're launching a new industry called scientific wellness.
So if I'm remembering correctly, you are also a triathlete, like I said, in your spare time.
Yes.
And I want to say that you yourself have been a client, as it were, of your own company. So just can you quickly walk us through like what that use case looks like if we haven't grokked what scientific wellness really means?
So my co-founder is a gentleman named Lee Hood, Dr. Lee Hood. And Lee Hood is extraordinary in that one of the first scientists to map the human genome. President Obama gave him the Presidential Medal of Science. If you're a scientist, it's an amazing honor to be invited into one of the 3 National Academies of Science. Lee's one of 15 people that's been in all 3. But wearing my venture capital hat, it was always my goal to back Lee Hood, because he has founded or co-founded 15 companies that are worth now $150 billion. And so he's one of those people that he creates a new industry. He's the father of systems biology. creates new industries and launches companies into them. So Lee came to me, invited me to go to his dinner. And I'm like, holy cow, I finally get to back Lee Hood. And as I sit down, he says, okay, Clayton, I'm going to create the largest company of my career. We're going to launch this whole new industry called scientific wellness. And you're going to be the CEO. And I'm like, wow, silly compliment. Tell me more. And so Lee shared with me this idea of looking at these 4 quadrants of data. And I said, well, Lee, as a venture capitalist the past 8 years looking at wellness, wellness is a failed category. A failed category for 3 reasons. One, most Americans don't wake up and think, today I'd like to be healthy. Chocolate cake right now, risk of diabetes, tends to be a clear choice. So that's the first issue, is you want to get, what are people motivated to do? I am motivated to be to place very well in Ironman triathlons. And so as we go into Lee giving me this idea, I'm in the middle of training for Ironman Canada and pretty much figure I'm going to be the healthiest person in the study. Very proud of that. And so we brought 108 people in and we did this beta test of the product. So as my data comes pouring back in, the first thing that I learn is I'm pre-diabetic. So I think, oh, that's someone else's data. That could not possibly be. Well, it turns out I'm doing an N of 1 experiment, which a lot of us do, and I decided the paleo diet, the paleo triathletes, they seem to be faster. And so my coach, looking first at my genetic data, helped me, and I have genetic variants that impact my ability definitely to process fats and also slow me down in processing all this protein I'm taking in. Second, I've got another genetic variant that makes complex rich carbohydrates jet fuel for my body. And so my coach dives in, and of course I'm working out 18 hours a week, and so looks at my lifestyle, looks at my genetic variants, looks at my clinical labs, and says, okay, we need to make some changes in how you're approaching your diet. And within 6 months, I'd normalized all my 3 markers related to prediabetes, no longer pre-diabetic. Next thing that was interesting is I'm also president of the board of Harborview Medical Center. Been on that board for 14 years. I have a great physician. I'm actively engaged in the healthcare system. I learned that I have toxic levels of mercury. Toxic levels of mercury. At 57, you do not want that. It has an impact on your neurological functions. And so once again, then as we dive into my genetics, I have genetic variants that impact my ability to process toxins. Now some people don't have those variants, so they might have processed that mercury. I am disadvantaged in that category. A lot of our clients, Ed Lazowska, that many of you may know, Ed allows me to share this story, but Ed, prominent member of the community, he's in the study. He's got toxic mercury. It's because he's eating too much tuna sushi, and he has the same genetic variant that I have. I'm eating salmon. So once again, my coach does some exploration. I have old fillings, old amalgam fillings. And she says, has your dentist suggested you get these replaced? I'm like, yeah, but why? Well, all of a sudden I'm motivated to have these fillings replaced, and now 2.5 years later, my mercury's almost normalized. And I could go on, but what's interesting in sort of the story here is that for each of our clients, our pioneers, when you put together the system, because the human body is a system, and you look at the systems in concert, it's really interesting then to identify the hot spots that are setting you up for disease states in the future. And I should quit talking and let you ask questions, but I'm so excited. So what's interesting to me is that our economy right now is very upside down, and not for many of the reasons Donald Trump would share with us, but it's because 18% of our GDP is going to treat illnesses. Now there's 3 drivers of human health. To who would help me out here, and what are the 3 drivers of human health?
Behavior.
Okay.
Diet.
Excellent.
Genetics.
Okay.
Desire.
Mm-hmm. Nice. That's very true.
I can tell you, a 96-year-old woman told me that.
Yes, I love that.
So,
I think that's true. I don't think we want to know anymore. So there's studies that indicate they fall into 3 buckets. So 30% genetics, 60% behavior, lifestyle, environment, and 10% the healthcare system. So we're devoting 18% of our GDP to the tiniest slice that impacts human health. And so that's why we are passionate about launching a new industry, scientific wellness, focused on the 90%.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you for that. No, the story does really help. But I know you're also passionate about inclusion and diversity and anti-discrimination, and that really, I'd like to frame up kind of the topic for this evening, which is diversity and entrepreneurship. So let me just kind of paint a picture of the current state that we're
Mhm.
living in, right? So, how many of you are in STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, math, right? So life sciences, tech, IT, kind of fall into these categories. So in STEM, the diversity statistics are deplorable, shall I say. 6% Hispanic, 7% African American, and it's 74% male and 68% white. Does that resonate with the experience we have in offices on an almost daily basis? So that's part of the story. What does it mean? What are the impacts? You look at, one of your fields, investing, only 8% of VCs in senior management are women. 97% of venture capital dollars go to companies started by white men. And on the other end of the spectrum, only 0.2% of venture capital dollars go to companies founded by African American women, right? So you see some of the impacts of this historic and persistent underrepresentation. You can look at the board level, and one of my sort of favorite, but again, most terrifying stats is only 17% of corporate boards are held by women. There are more men on corporate boards named John than there are women on corporate boards. Just to put it into perspective for you, isn't that terrifying?
Yeah.
And when we kind of start looking at the LGBTQ community, I will say that it's challenging to really understand the problem and the opportunity here. There was a survey just last year that suggested, again, in the STEM field, that 43% of the LGBTQ community working in STEM was not out. Did not feel like work was a safe place for them to be out. And I can only imagine some of the implications of that. But I just kind of wanted to frame up some of the issues that we're grappling with as entrepreneurs, as employers, as investors, as citizens in the United States today. And I think that we could go any number of ways with it, but I'd love to just sort of get the conversation going around what does that mean in terms of kind of social justice, and that's clearly a passion point for you, but also what does it mean when it comes to running a business?
So
dive in.
3 thoughts, and then also I'd love to hear from you guys if you have thoughts to share also. So in my 20s, I worked in politics. And so I was student body president at UW, and that launched me into being an activist and really being passionate around politics. And every candidate I worked for, or every elected official I worked for, was a woman. And what was very interesting about that for that 10-year decade is that women were a rare commodity in elected office. This is back in the 80s. And so, but what we saw was as women started to get elected to local positions and then state positions, that became the feeder for Congress, and ultimately I became chief of staff to one of the few women in the House of Representatives at that moment in time. So the first thing I think we have to think through, both in business, in politics, and in life, is that you've got to start to, where do you, one, identify you're going to have an impact on the problem? Because you've got to start somewhere. We can't just talk about it. And so when I think now about my 8 years in the investment community, because at Mavrum we talk about that a lot, and we also are pretty focused on what do we do to drive diversity. And at Mavrum we're a consumer-only venture capital firm, and so a slice of the pie. So one, as we are out recruiting new partners now, we only are recruiting women. And so we want to bring better balance around the table, and we're recruiting people at a very for my young age, and so you're starting to see a mix in our partnership. The next thing that's been interesting is that historically within the venture community, they've wanted to back people with track records, because for most venture, it's about, okay, what has this person done? Well, of course, that's self-perpetuating. Now, what's interesting, and I'm not sure people even fully appreciate the impact we see of what's going to happen, is that when I joined the firm 8 years ago, all we did was core investments. And so a core investment, we want to deploy between $5 and $10 billion. We want to own 20% of the company. And we can make a limited number of core investments each year. We're all about the people we're backing. And so, track record is critical. So how do you get a track record if you're new into an industry? So that was 8 years ago. Fast forward till today. Today, we're making 2 seed investments a month. And so what does that mean? We are meeting a really diverse group of individuals, and we're taking much lower cost risk ways to get to know people. We do that for 3 reasons. First, we want to get to know a person over time. Second, we're exploring new sectors like the virtual reality. We just recently are making investments there. And then third, we want to position ourselves to be well favored as this entrepreneur is going out to do an A. And so I was thinking about the topic tonight, so I went and looked at the seed investments that we've done over the past 24 months. Half have been either women or minority CEOs. Now that doesn't, I'm sorry to say, match our track record on the core investments now, but what's also happening is that half of our core investments over the past 12 months have come from our seed program. And so there's an example where I think you have to actually make structural changes, where you have to say, what fundamentally are we going to do? What are we committing ourselves to? What are we signing up for to actually change the infrastructure and what's going on? And so, one, clarity of purpose. Two, a clear program, because things don't happen by happenstance. And then three, modeling. And I was thinking about the LGBT piece also. If you look at some of the oldest companies in Seattle, Microsoft, when Bill Gates launched the company, so he was launching Microsoft when I was in college, and I was on the board of regents with Mary, his mother, got to know Bill a little bit. Microsoft hired some very out gay individuals, and it was a very safe place for them. And so all of a sudden you've got this young startup in Seattle, and they're inviting a very diverse group of people coming in, and I think that foundationally is a lot of the reason for Microsoft's early success is people could go there, be themselves, not be worried about what do they have to hide or discrimination, or think of even Tina Padelowski, who just ran for Secretary of State, an early executive at Microsoft. So they were bringing a very diverse audience in. Another recent example that I think's empowering is Amazon. So Jeff Bezos is not known for being active in the community or actually even caring that much about the community. But Jeff and his wife gave $500,000 to the Marriage Equality Initiative. And that was a very big deal. And I think I've done some work with the HR group at Amazon, and either the number one or number two guy there is gay. And so all of a sudden you've got these cultures where you're modeling behavior and you're creating a safe space for it. And so one, it doesn't just happen, it's hard work. Two, you've got to have clarity of purpose and state it. And then three, you've got to put the infrastructure in place to actually make it happen.
Yeah, and so I think lots of takeaways in there that we could unpack a bit, but thinking about your intention and purpose with MavRun. One, you really expanded your pipeline of deals, right? So that's a technique that not just investors but employers, I think, can keep in mind. Two, you are really purposeful and intentional in your hiring practices. And the fact that you're bringing in 100% women at the partner level is so powerful when you think. Do you know Cindy Pagnos of Eliminate Ventures?
No.
All women, B2B focused VC firm in the Valley. But Cindy did a white paper a couple years ago now, where kind of fixing on that statistics of basically kind of 1 in 10. So you're probably the only woman partner in a room making your Monday afternoon decisions on what deals you're going to do. So imagine you're that one woman, and Cindy actually broke this down in her white paper, and you think to yourself, gosh, there's this really amazing CEO, great product market fit, really scalable business, all the things you're looking for. And she thinks to herself, gosh, I just backed a woman CEO last week. I can't back another woman CEO. Can you imagine a white guy saying, I just backed a white guy last week. I can't do it again, right? So when you get more women in the conversation, when you have more diversity, you're going to take some of that stigma and that real or perceived social pressure out of those investment decisions.
Yes.
Really powerful. So I applaud you for being so purposeful in your hiring practices. So we've already kind of started diving into some of the techniques, and I think a little bit of the impacts of diversity or lack thereof. But what do you think, how does it positively impact your business to have diversity at the table?
So there's both very clear ways that it does, and then there's very subtle ways. So as a consumer-only venture capital firm, well, who makes most of the buying decisions of a household? The head of the household tends to be a woman. And so it's, we kind of joke that there tends to be these white, wealthy, middle-aged guys making decisions of what products should be put in front of a market they don't really understand. And there's even, to be blunt, like sometimes I'll meet partners in other firms and I'll say, oh, what would my wife think about that? And so that perspective is not a powerful perspective to actually be making decisions around the table. Second, what I learned in my time in politics for two really important women I worked for, Nita Reinhardt, who was here in the Senate years ago, and then Louise Slaughter, who's now the ranking Democrat, still the ranking Democrat on the House Rules Committee, is there's a very different perspective in terms of approaching and really an idea, and this sounds so stereotypical, but I think to a degree I've seen this, of problem solving and really diving towards outcomes versus winning. And so, once again, is that I think if you're going to have a richness in your business and what you're trying to do, you want to have a real great diversity both in your workforce, around the table, and then also, what's interesting where my head goes, it's building relationships over time. Because the joy of being 57 is it feels like I've worked with half of Seattle. And so, I've had lots of colleagues from various companies. And what's also powerful is when I think about the people that have been most impactful in my professional life, I've been really intentional about having a diverse group of friends. And the richness that brings, everything from family experiences to their approach to viewing the world, has such an impact in terms of then thinking, A, how are you going to solve complex problems? B, what should you be taking to market? Versus having this uniform view where it's so easy and comfortable to fall into. And even hiring. So I have a process I go through when I'm working with teams on hiring, but what I try to say to anyone engaged in an interview is that if you first immediately like someone, well then you're feeling comfortable and you're happy because you're going to hire yourself. And so if you really like someone initially in an interview, really force yourself intellectually to dive deep and to do the discovery you need to do. If you don't initially feel comfortable with someone in an interview, figure out how do you open your doors in your mind to get much more engaged, and once again do that discovery process to determine, does this person bring the skill set, the expertise, the insights you're looking for in that position.
And I want to spend a lot more time on interviews. You think about what sort of employers or investors can do to increase diversity. But I want to just reinforce a couple of the points that I think you made. One is businesses run better when your workforce or your decision makers reflect the customer base that you're serving, right? You better understand your customers. And two, I think part of what I heard is that having diverse voices at the table forces a better decision-making, problem-solving type of process. I'm sure you know Jonathan Sposato, and hopefully that name is familiar. He is one of the only folks who's built and sold 2 companies to Google. He is the chairman and main investor in GeekWire, a technology news site here. And just about a year and a half ago, I think to his surprise, he said out loud in a room like this at a conference that he was only going to back startups that had at least one woman founder. And I think that Jonathan is a delightful and thoughtful person, but that's not the only reason that he did it, because he is a social justice champion and ally. He is very hard-nosed, practical capitalist. He'll be the first one to tell you that. And over time, studies have found that founding teams with at least one woman perform better financially. Right? It's just building a better business through diverse teams. So I just really want us to understand, right? It's not just, and I hope that many of us, embrace the of race and social justice and gender equity and anti-discrimination, but just as good, smart business people, diversity makes a real impact. All right. So. And please chime in. Like, we could sit here and talk to each other for hours, I suspect. But if anybody wants to share perspectives from their lived experience, or hopefully this feels like a safe space to do that. But again, I just want to sort of take a breather and say we don't consider it an interruption, because I've got lots more questions for you. Yes, please.
With your current business, who did you originally market towards? Like, who did you test, and then also who are you marketing towards right now? Because I know it's quite a high cost, a couple $1,000s just for that.
So the question, if you didn't hear, so who's your original kind of target market and customer acquisition cost with Arivale?
So we think about consumers in 3 categories. So the first category we call health optimizers. So I'm a health optimizer as a triathlete. I'm not particularly brand loyal. If someone says they're going to make me faster, I'm probably going to be right there with them. Give them a try. Our target market are what we call health hopefuls. Health hopefuls tend to be late 30s plus. They've had a health scare somewhere within their frame of reference. They recognize this aging thing is real. They're not too happy about it. And there the consumer is spending billions of dollars on devices, on programs, and really unsatisfied. The third category, what we call health deniers, and they're not our target market.
Okay.
Did that answer the question?
Somewhat, but I'm also curious about how you find these people, how do you target them?
Great. So in Seattle, we launched the company in July of last year. And our objective was to, within about 4 to 5 months, get to 1,000 pioneers so we could pressure test our systems as we're scaling. And it was pretty amazing for us in that Lee Hood has a very big brand in this area. And so Lee and I would go out and give speeches. We were fortunate to have a lot of press. We won GeekWire Startup of the Year, a number of things. And so organically, 800 people found their way to us within a very short period of time. And it was interesting to see what they did. Now, concurrently, I wanted to set the business up success over the long term. So I went up and down the West Coast, and I leveraged my Rolodex, Howard Schultz's Rolodex, Lee Hood's Rolodex, and met with CEOs that you would know all of their names. And I said, Lee and I did this study last year and dramatically improved people's health. We'd love for you and your spouse to go through the program. And if we improve your health, we'd like you to consider rolling this program out to your employees and offering it at a very heavy subsidy. And so we're right now in the middle of our 4th enterprise launch. We launched initially within the Seattle market. 3 weeks ago, we launched in California. And so I've been on the road 80% of the time for the past 3 weeks. And so spending a lot of time in the California market. And we have 3 acquisition channels. People coming to us directly. Second, through employers sponsoring it for their enterprises. And then third, healthcare systems know there have to be changes, and so we're very fortunate that the Providence healthcare system, 3rd largest not-for-profit in the country, from Alaska to Arizona, they're putting 2,000 of their employees in our program. So healthcare is becoming a channel also.
So let's bring that around now to kind of a couple of the passions in your life, scientific wellness and anti-discrimination and inclusion. I suspect that part of Arivale's mission is really to reduce discrimination in healthcare practices. So how do you weave that into your business practices, and how is that part of kind of not just your founding vision, but your day-to-day execution?
So the ultimate big idea is the democratization of wellness or healthcare. So that's the big idea. And we have visions and thoughts in terms of by 1920, what we're going to be able to do to actually materially reduce the price point. And also, part of what will happen, I believe, in the healthcare system that will be pulling us in. And so I'll start there and then I'll work my way back. So the 14 years I've been on the Harvard Review Board, it's been very interesting in that initially, healthcare as a system, 14 years ago, it was about billing codes. You had to bill for the right medication, you had to bill for the right hour, and you had to do the coding correctly. Right now, we're in what's called volume-based pricing. And this is not Harvard Review, this is healthcare in general. So what is volume-based pricing? Now we have to code the events correctly because we're going to get reimbursed about the same amount if we keep you for a couple days or a couple weeks based on what condition you have. So volume-based pricing. Where we're moving because of healthcare reform, because of Obamacare, is we're moving to value-based pricing. So what does that mean? One example would be here in this market, the Boeing company issued an RFP. And they basically issued an RFP for about 20,000 of their employees. And they said to healthcare providers, you can bid to earn this book of business, but instead of increasing your prices every year, as you've historically done, you're responsible for these lives. We've got important metrics on customer satisfaction, patient safety, outcomes, but you've got a fixed cost contract, and I'm being more binary than the contract is, of course. But the implication there is that now these accountable care networks are becoming more common, and so where I think healthcare is going to move over time is actually focused on keeping us well, as opposed to treating symptoms. We're extraordinarily fortunate to have a brilliant healthcare system from treating symptoms, but as most of us know, the healthcare system's not designed to optimize our wellness. That's not their business model. And it's not saying anything bad, that is not. So point number one when I think about scientific wellness and the democratization of healthcare is that, as we know, health tends to be related to economic status. And so what are one of the first things that we're going to do to try to share knowledge in terms of what it means to optimize wellness? And that means very different people, very different things for different people based on your genetic predisposition. And we could talk a lot about that, which would be fascinating. So item number one. Item number two is a radical reduction in a scientific wellness type program so it becomes much more accessible. Item number 3, today you can't use reimbursements, insurance, or any of this money we spend on treating illnesses can't be used to actually help you fund a scientific wellness program, which is irrational, given what I said before of 18% of our GDP on treating illnesses. So we're going to have to drive some major public policy changes. It might be challenging over the next 4 years. But what I would say that's also interesting is that healthcare reform has a major problem in that the networks are failing. So why are the exchanges, I should say? The exchanges are failing because there was an initial model that X number of healthy people would go into the networks and then that would blend out. Not enough healthy people went in the networks. The prices of the exchanges are going up radically. So some big change has to happen there anyway. Did that answer?
Yeah, so let's, I think we're good. So let's zoom out a little bit. And you know, and you've got so much experience you can draw on, whether it's your own practices at Arivale, portfolio companies that you've worked with at Mavron, or some of your past corporate experience. I think there are a lot of ways we can think about supporting diversity and inclusion in our workforce. You touched on a couple already, right? You touched on kind of expanding your pipeline. You started to sort of tease out interview practices. You also mentioned role models, and I want to come back to each of these. But you started on the path of the interview process, so let's talk about that. You mentioned, I think, that if you're feeling uncomfortable, that's a great time to engage. So can you talk a little bit more about techniques that you use, or even questions that you ask that you think are supportive of an inclusive culture and workforce?
So I think the hiring process should be a conversation. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out, okay, is this person set up for success here? And then you're trying to figure out that person, figuring out, do they really want to work here? And so it shouldn't at all be a one-way process. It should very much be a discovery process on both sides. And so within that, first thing you've got to do when you're hiring is you've got to be really thoughtful around what are we hiring for and what does that look like. So as CEO of a company, I won't approve any hiring position if there's not a scorecard. And what the scorecard is doing is the scorecard is, one, speaking to what are the domain expertise we're looking for, but equally as important, the scorecard is speaking to our values. And so we're going in and diving deep to try to understand what has this person done in their life that reflects their values. And we have values such as trust. We have values such as related to honesty. We have a value of being scrappy. And so a scorecard where you're trying to understand what are we hiring for, and having a lot of clarity with the person of what you're hiring for. So job 1, define the job. Job 2, come up with a scorecard. Job 3, figure out the hiring committee that's going to be really transparent with, this is what success looks like here and what we're going for, what are you interested in doing, having each person responsible for diving into certain areas. Then when I personally am either making an investment or if I'm diving deep with someone who's going to be a direct report to me, I have a 3-hour interview I take that person through. So why 3 hours? So the first thing is that some people can be an extraordinary interview. Like, I'm an extraordinary interview. But if it doesn't mean necessarily that if you spend an hour with me, you're going to get to know me. So what I love about 3 hours is that I actually then get to push my boundaries on if initially I didn't feel comfortable with this person, over time, 3 hours, I'm going to be comfortable, or I'm not. Next, over time, the reason that process is important is you want to have a conversation. And that's the formal process, and we'll get to the informal process in a minute. The interview process is very straightforward. First, I start with 3 headline questions. First, tell me about your career and don't mention any of the jobs you've held. Just like, what's the arc of your career and why have you gone on this journey? So in that question, I'm trying to understand, like, why do they want to work? What are their motivations? What brings them joy? And trying to get some sense of how they've thought about it. Second question, what are you really good at? And so out of the gate, I want to understand how do they think about the strengths they're bringing to the table. Third question, what are you not good at? What do you not enjoy? And there you want to understand, do people even have the ability to be self-reflective? What insights do they have about themselves? And if they say things like, oh, I'm not good at not working 100 hours a week. And so then for each position they've held, and I start usually right out of high school, 5 questions. First one, what were you hired to do? And so really interesting again, why did they go there? what did they discover, and why did they decide to take that job? Second, what are you most proud of? So what's so interesting there is that as a venture capitalist, what is the primary thing I have to do for my limited partners? And my limited partners are endowments, it's the Carnegie Fund, it's the Getty Museum. Like, my job is to make endowments money. Well, if they are not some way driving metrics as a CEO coming into me, if they don't have some passion around changing the world and building $1 billion business, if they don't have some incredible drive there, and they often don't. So that's like a really good sign. So what are you most proud of? Because I'm now looking at patterns. What have they done? What are they interested in doing? Second, what was the lowest point of that job? Like, you were humiliated. And once again, trying to get insights, do they have self-discovery in their life? Because it's amazing the number of candidates, number of individuals who actually didn't learn anything. And what I'm looking for is what demonstration of learning that they had. This next question is the most important. Who did you work for there? Who was your direct report? How do you spell their name? You write it down. When I called John, what is he going to tell me were your best attributes? So 3 things happen. 1, they think, holy crap, he's going to call him. 2, they get an opportunity to speak in third person. So it's very interesting to hear how people are reflecting what other people are going to say about them. Okay, great. So those are what your strengths are. What is John going to tell me were your opportunities for improve? Like, did he do reviews? What coaching did he give you? So once again, are they learning? What are the demonstrations there? And then what was it like? Oh, and I missed the point. How's John going to rate you on a 10-point scale? And people hate that. And they don't want to go there. But it's been really interesting at times. Like, I was interviewing a very high-powered executive on paper, looked brilliant. And as I got to this one position, like, well, how would he rate you? And didn't want to answer. Before it had been like 9s and 8s and all those good things, and it was a 4, and then all this stuff poured out because he thought he's going to call that person. Now, didn't end up hiring him, but great discovery process. And then the final question: why did you decide to leave? And then I think you can't just interview people in that type of settings. Then you need to go out and break bread with them. And the reason I think that's so important is then you're looking to see how do they treat other people. Because they're sucking up to me because they want a job, right? I don't mean that disrespectfully, but it's just like they're trying to impress me. The number of people I've taken out who've been rude to a wait person or have been somewhat abrasive to people, and you think, that's not our culture. Like, that's not going to work here. And so that also is very interesting. And then I think the most important thing are references, and references they give you and references they don't give you. And we've got a whole set of questions around that.
Yeah, so thinking about how this interview process feeds into an inclusive and diverse culture, what I'm hearing from you is that you really focus on kind of self-awareness and the interview as a discovery process and a way to surface values. One word I didn't hear you use, and I'm delighted, is fit. I have found in the years and years of interviews that I've done, is that it's a little scary when somebody says, gosh, that person just doesn't seem to fit. Well, what does fit mean? Fit is that person who's comfortable, right? Fit is the person who looks like you. Fit becomes you've got an echo chamber of interviewers and you're just hiring people who look and sound exactly like you, and that does not serve diversity or inclusion. So it might sound like rhetoric, but I think that language is really important and really impactful. I will say too, and I more have examples of what not to do, so I want to hear more about what you do that's positive, that enforces diversity and inclusion. It'll be interesting, sitting with, and we're very purposeful about having an interview panel that reflects both our department and our community. I work for the city public sector, that is literally in our charter. But as we're evaluating candidates, it's so interesting to hear, when we talk about a man and being, really assertive and, gosh, when a woman is just not aggressive enough. I mean, there's all of this sort of coded gender-based language that I think we need to be really mindful of in the way we describe people. And make sure that that we're aware. It's almost impossible to be aware of your implicit biases unless you're really, really focused on it. And language is a big, big part of that. What other tips do you have, like things to do versus things to avoid in welcoming, an inclusive and diverse workforce?
So what are you doing at the recruitment funnel? So what are you doing at the top in terms of actually inviting people in and asking people to invite people in and help drive that? Another thing that's an interesting tool, and it's something I've used almost for 15 years now, and it doesn't exactly speak to diversity, but it speaks to normalizing in terms of not dealing with the uncomfortable aspects. So it's an assessment tool called the Harrison. And so what I love about the Harrison is that what it does is it's not right or wrong, but it talks about predisposition. So are you predisposed to have relationships be extraordinarily important? So are you a 10 on affiliation, or are you on a 2? It goes through and it lists what are your top 4 to 5 must-haves. And so I'll give you an example. One of my partners at Mavron, I'd worked there for a year, and we're on this plane together, and he turns to me and he goes, "You don't like me, do you?" And I'm thinking, like, you get a dog. Like, we're not here to have friends, and not tight friends. And so the reason the Harrison was important, and I think it helps cut through cultural issues also in an interesting way, is it assigns language to things we know about ourselves.